Hi, my name is Jessica Nielson, and this is Becoming a Psychedelic Scientist. So I am currently an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota. I work in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and I'm also core faculty at the Institute for Health Informatics. And I'm going to be giving you a little brief overview of the process that I've gone through to become a psychedelic scientist at the university. And I will then follow up with how you could become a psychedelic scientist or researcher or therapist, given what I've learned during my time getting to this phase of my research. And hopefully any of that I tell you will be useful in your own efforts to head down this path yourself. So just some disclosures real briefly. As an employee of the University of Minnesota, it is important that I disclose some of my financial relationships that I have that fund my research, as well as some other business and personal disclosures. So I am funded by a research grant from the National Institute of Mental Health. I have local funding through the University of Minnesota Foundation, which was created due to generous donations from the community to set up a psychedelic assisted therapy fund, or the PATH fund, specifically as a discretionary fund to help psychedelic research at the University of Minnesota. I am founder and former associate director of the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota, co-founder of the Decriminalize Minneapolis movement, and founder of Psychonauts of Minnesota. I would like to disclose that my privilege as a white, cis, hetero woman, my pronouns are she and her, as well as the great privilege, given all of that, to be an out psychonaut. And also to acknowledge the land that we're on for the University of Minnesota as a white person. You know, I am working on stolen land and living on stolen land here in Minneapolis. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The university resides on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. So now I'm just going to give a brief overview and history of how I got involved in psychedelic research. My journey started officially in 2008, when I first discovered the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies while I was attending the annual festival called Burning Man. For those of you who don't know what Burning Man is, I encourage you to look it up. It's a pretty cool event. And so prior to this, I had actually just gotten back from Amsterdam, where I had tried psilocybin mushrooms there, where they were legal at the time. I had experience back in college and high school with experimenting with psychedelics prior to that, but then had taken a really long break while I was in graduate school getting my PhD in neuroscience, and happened to take a trip to Europe and visited Amsterdam and tried psilocybin mushrooms again, and had my first breakthrough mystical experience on psilocybin mushrooms, and then serendipitously discovered MAPS the following summer at Burning Man, and happened to attend a lecture there about people doing psychedelic research and therapy at places like UCLA and Johns Hopkins, and was just blown away that this was even a viable option for myself and others to be working in the field of psychedelic research professionally. I'd always thought it was a very underground field, but it turns out it was very much becoming above ground, and there was this large nonprofit organization, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, that was spearheading a lot of this work. And so I was really eager to figure out how I could become involved. So when I finished my PhD, I got my PhD in neurobiology, specifically focusing on trauma in 2010. And by the time I had finished my PhD, I was pretty burnt out from graduate school. I had gone through a really messy divorce while I was writing my dissertation, and also had some trauma around doing animal research at the time. And so I didn't really want to use my degree, and I wanted to leave the field of science, and ended up being homeless for a while after I got my PhD and was living in my car for about 4 months, and serendipitously met somebody who offered to send me to Peru to help me treat my trauma by taking ayahuasca at this retreat center that he had opened up. So this is just a few kind of screen captures of that process. I actually was able to be part of a National Geographic documentary, which kind of came about because when I came back from this trip from Peru, I reached out to Rick Doblin at MAPS to ask if there was any studies that were looking at ayahuasca for post-traumatic stress disorder. And he said no, but if you want to be our person to study this, then we'll support your efforts in that and help connect you to resources and people to help you along that. So one of their first things that they tasked me to do was to go back down to the same retreat center down in Peru with National Geographic to document ayahuasca being used to treat PTSD in trauma survivors. My first trip down there was with some war veterans that were being treated with PTSD and kind of feeling inspired by watching their transformation unfold with ayahuasca and how it helped their PTSD. And then going down there a second time to be part of this documentary to serve as the quote unquote expert about how ayahuasca could be a useful therapy for PTSD. So when I came back from that trip, I started working on kind of putting the idea out there that ayahuasca might be a good therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. So I'll just briefly kind of run through how that all unfolded. So I first started by co-authoring kind of a position piece in the MAPS bulletin in 2012 with a psychiatric nurse practitioner that I met at University of California, San Francisco, where I was a postdoc at the time. So we published this bulletin from that. We were both invited to speak at this Women's Entheogenic Symposium that was hosted in 2013 as sort of a precursor to the larger psychedelic science conference that MAPS was hosting in 2013, where I gave a talk on kind of this hypothesis that I had that ayahuasca could treat post-traumatic stress disorder. I had presented data from some trip reports that some of the veterans I was with in Peru shared with me. This is an example of a word cloud where they basically were really emphasizing that this was a medicine for them that helped with their PTSD. And this was actually published in a book chapter in 2014 in the book, The Therapeutic Use of Ayahuasca. This was just some preliminary data from that, where we looked at trip reports from Arrowwood for people that had taken ayahuasca, and noting that although there was a lot of difficult experiences that people would report, they also reported that they were glowing experiences or mystical experiences, but not bad trips. So I think that's pretty telling. And so through all of this, through giving talks at the conferences and doing the National Geographic documentary, I was getting a lot of requests for interviews in various magazines and news outlets, which I was happy to oblige at the time because I was a budding psychedelic researcher and really trying to get my name out into the field. And that was really exciting at the time. But unfortunately, what followed was a lot of bad press about bad experiences of people going down to Peru to take ayahuasca and, death and exploitation and all kinds of harm being done, both to people taking ayahuasca as well as one incident where somebody went down and actually murdered a shaman, which is very tragic. And so there seemed to be this sort of dark side emerging in ayahuasca tourism and the kind of white colonial Western demand for healing. For what some would call diseases of civilization and Westernization, but I won't get into that. And so, at the time I was working with Rick Doblin and Bia Labate, who both work at MAPS. Bia Labate is a very well-respected anthropologist working in the field of ayahuasca for many, many years. And she's been a wonderful mentor and role model to me. And we were trying to get a study moving forward that would give people ayahuasca to treat PTSD and trying to do that in the United States. But there was just a lot of logistical issues and trying to figure out what would the supply be that the FDA would accept. It's kind of hard to get a botanical product through the FDA, especially when it's a Schedule I drug and it's predominantly coming from another country. There was like import, export permits we were trying to navigate from Peru. We tried Brazil. It was really complicated. Ultimately, we weren't able to actually get it up and running, but because all of this hype was going out about the potential of ayahuasca to treat PTSD, there's a lot of people going to try ayahuasca to treat their PTSD. And I wasn't sure that that was a good approach, or that people were doing it responsibly, or that there were safe places for them to do it. So I had been noticing that there was a lot of surveys that were being published by people at Johns Hopkins, where basically they were anonymous online surveys that seemed to be a really good and easy and quick way to get a lot of data about a specific research question related to psychedelics. And so I decided to do my own study, survey study, to look at ayahuasca for PTSD, specifically to ask people that have been to a retreat center or had done ayahuasca in some setting to treat their PTSD, if it worked, and if it did, what helped them, and if it didn't, what didn't help them, or what was potentially dangerous or harmful to them. And so I won't go through the details of the survey just for time, but I was able to get some preliminary data to show that, for the most part, there were benefits, but there were some harms that people were talking about that really need to be taken into consideration. And I presented this. I did another round of psychedelic conferences, psychedelic science conference. I was able to be interviewed in this book, Changing Our Minds. I like to plug this just real quick because some of you may be familiar with this book, How to Change Your Mind. But actually this book came out a year before by this author, Don Lattin. He wrote another really great book called the Harvard Psychedelic Club about what happened with Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert when they were at Harvard trying to do psychedelic research, and they're subsequently being fired. Anyway, he's a really great author, and he basically wrote the same book, in theory as this one, and almost the same title. But obviously we hear more about Michael Pollan's book than Don Lattin's book. So if you get a chance to check it out, I highly recommend it. I think it really is sort of the original version of the How to Change Your Mind book. And I would like to see it get more credit. So moving forward, I moved to Minnesota in 2018 to become an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota. And one of my first kind of actions was really trying to figure out how to get psychedelic research up and running here as part of my lab. And I also started a psychedelic society. And through that, there was some members of the community that were eager to donate money to help support research locally at the University of Minnesota. So that's set up if anyone wants to donate to therapy or to the research happening at the University of Minnesota. Just some more talks, presenting the work. So fast forward, I was actually able to get a grant from the university to study psilocybin-assisted therapy for alcohol use disorder, which is really exciting. However, there was some sort of internal issues with one of the clinicians on the study who decided kind of at the last minute before we were about to, move forward and get this funding secured that they backed out and I lost the grant. So I took about a year to kind of reorient myself and figure out how to keep moving forward, doing psilocybin research at the university. And so fast forward to the end of 2019, I got an investigational new drug protocol approved by the Food and Drug Administration to study the effects of psilocybin on visual perception. Starting off in healthy volunteers, and hopefully once we get enough preliminary data, we'll be able to extend that into a patient population and see if psilocybin can help with trauma. So that's to be on the horizon. And so that is registered currently on clinicaltrials.gov. We're obviously working in the middle of a pandemic, so we're trying to figure out like logistics of making sure that we're doing this safely and we're not exposing people to COVID. So it's been a little slow going, but we have all of our approvals in place and we're ready to get up and running. I've also got a new chapter coming out in this book. I won't go into that, but it's again more of that ayahuasca research I talked about, which I won't go into just for the sake of time. I think another important aspect of being a psychedelic researcher is being involved in the psychedelic community and advocating for psychedelics because they are currently Schedule I drugs. And what that means is that they have no accepted therapeutic use and they're considered to be harmful and potentially addictive. And so it turns out none of that's actually true for something like psilocybin, which the FDA has actually granted breakthrough therapy designation for the treatment of depression. So anyway, so I think it's important to really kind of focus on harm reduction around psychedelics because there's a lot of hype. There's a lot of information going around about the therapeutic uses of psychedelics, especially psilocybin. And it's really important that not only are we doing really good research around this and clinical trials on seeing who it is and isn't appropriate for, especially when treating major mental illnesses like treatment-resistant depression. But also like having community because people are going to do psychedelics and having peer support is equally as important. So one aspect of peer support that I want to touch on is the Zendo project. They started in 2012. And it's really kind of like a psychedelic crisis center that gets set up at festivals to help people that are having a hard time on psychedelics to be able to come in and have a safe place and container to process that with a trained professional or peer support person who knows how to handle someone who's having an altered state of consciousness in a potential psychedelic crisis. So that's been around since 2012, and I highly recommend checking them out if you want to get involved in learning how to support your friends and community. And especially if you're going to be going to a festival, maybe connecting with the group if they are going to have a presence there. Other aspects of community engagement, I've given talks at festivals on just sort of like the cool science around psychedelics. Also doing this, I won't go into this, but it was a pretty cool talk about kind of psychedelic data science and whatnot that I gave in San Francisco when I used to live there. And then when I moved to Minnesota, I started a psychedelic society so that I could make some friends, some other fellow psychonauts, as well as to kind of help plant the seed and get some movement going in the psychedelic space in my new home of Minnesota. That has since transitioned into the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota. It was originally the Psychedelic Society of Minneapolis. I had come from San Francisco, where I was part of the San Francisco Psychedelic Society. There's like 300 chapters of the Psychedelic Society all over the world. If you're not aware of them, I suggest you check them out. It's a pretty cool community. I have this meetup group, which you all are here watching this for, which is the Psychedelic Neuroscience group. It's more related to my clinical research at the university and really understanding how psychedelics impact the brain, because I am a neuroscientist by training, and I'm really fascinated by psychedelics as almost like a microscope or a telescope for the human brain and the mind. So they're pretty fascinating, and it's a really exciting area of research. And I like to, host events like these, educate the public, not only on the science of it, but how to get involved in the science, how to get trained in the science. So, so this is an ongoing project. One thing I do want to point out is that the psychedelic community is predominantly white and hasn't always been a welcoming place for people of color. Just due to a lack of representation and what some would call spiritual bypassing, that people are having these really great psychedelic experiences that make them feel like everyone is one, but then kind of also ignoring the reality of the world that they live in and getting a little hostile when you try to bring these things up within the psychedelic community. And so, and this is not only in the psychedelic community, it also exists in psychedelic research. So pretty much all of the clinical trials that are happening at places like NYU and Johns Hopkins, all of the researchers and the therapists are white, and all the research participants are white. So there was a push to change this by Monica Williams and her trainees and her colleagues. She was working at the University of Connecticut, and she was actually one of the only therapists of color trained to administer the MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD protocol that MAPS was doing. And I'll get into that in a little bit more in a second, but there's really a push in the psychedelic therapy field to really diversify the therapists and the researchers, so that the patients and the participants that want to engage with this are going to be doing so with a culturally competent therapist or researcher that understands their unique situation. And so I'll get into that more in a second, but just also, a nod to all the indigenous practices that a lot of these things came from. Ayahuasca is a traditional plant medicine used in religious ceremonies in the Amazon in South America. Psilocybin is, a sacred medicine that's been used in Mexico. And peyote obviously is the sacrament for the Native American church, and all of these things have been highly appropriated by white researchers and clinicians to serve our Western demand for wellness and spirituality. And so I think it behooves folks like myself, white privileged researchers, to really make sure that we're paying attention to what are the traditions and the cultural practices around these psychedelic substances that we're using in our research, and also making sure that our teams are diverse and we have appropriate representation in our therapy and research team that matches the participants that will be coming in, and putting themselves in a very vulnerable situation and opening up their minds to us and exploring their consciousness with us, and making sure that we have all of the anti-racist and culturally informed training in place, or the appropriate staff in place to help people facilitate the most beneficial experience that they can have, where they feel trust and they feel that they can really surrender and open up to the experience for their own benefit. So a new organization I started is the Psychonauts of Minnesota, which is really trying to steer my own work and my own community engagement kind of away from the traditional psychedelic community, and really trying to focus more on issues around inclusivity and diversity and social justice, and representation within the community for people of color that want to join the community, that might be wanting to get involved in psychedelic research, either as researchers or as participants, and making sure that, I'm doing my part to make my lab and my community more inclusive and representative of everyone that wants to do psychedelics and partake in psychedelic research and therapy. Okay, so next is, how can you start down this path of becoming a psychedelic researcher? So first things first, you have to decide, what do you want to be when you grow up? And that's kind of a joke, because we're all adults here, but there are some people that are still trying to figure out what they want to do. They've decided, they want to be a psychedelic therapist or a psychedelic researcher. They want to get into drug policy or some other psychedelic related profession. And so let me just dig into, well, first, let me just say, for any of these things, if you want to be a psychedelic therapist, you first need to become a therapist. If you want to be a psychedelic researcher, you first need to become a researcher, a well-trained researcher. If you want to be a drug policy person, you have to learn policy, you have to learn the law, you have to learn what a legislator would do. So that involves school and training. So in order to be a psychedelic therapist, first things first, you have to become a licensed therapist. So there's various avenues for this. If you aren't already and you're interested in becoming a therapist, you don't necessarily have to become a medical doctor. You don't have to go to 4 years of medical school and 4 years of residency to become a psychiatrist. You could become a psychologist. So you could get a PsyD, a psychology doctorate, or a PhD. But then getting that degree in clinical psychology, you still then also need to get a license so that you can practice. So for a doctoral level psychologist, this would be an LP license. Another option is a nurse practitioner. These are essentially doctors. They're sort of very advanced nurses that are able to, in some states, prescribe and treat patients as if they were the kind of primary physician. You could also be a mental health counselor. So this involves basically getting a master's. So you can get either an MA or an MS in some sort of psychology-based program that focuses on therapy and counseling. You could get a master's in social work. I don't think that acronym is correct. And then once you have those degrees, you then need to do additional hours to get a license, and you need a license in order to practice. So these include a license in clinical social work, a license in marriage and family therapy, or the license psychological clinical counselor. And so all of those are just bare bones minimum if you want to become a therapist. Now, if you want to become a psychedelic therapist, then you need to do additional training and enroll in one of the psychedelic therapy and research training programs that exist. Right now, there are some around MDMA, specifically with MAPS for the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD trials. And then there are sort of these kind of one-off psilocybin therapies that aren't really formalized like MAPS has done. But hopefully that's going to change soon, because these are basically the two therapies that are coming through the pipeline. MDMA is finishing up phase 3, which is sort of the last phase that's needed before it gets approved by the FDA. And psilocybin is in phase 2, but both of them have received FDA breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA. So they're very promising, and we're going to need a lot more therapists to administer this, because it's a lot more involved than just being a therapist and having a license. There's additional training specifically around working with people in altered states of consciousness, especially if you're treating something like trauma. Okay. So what are some of these therapy training programs? So like I said, MAPS has their own therapist training program that they do, where it's pretty expensive to be part of it. And they usually only train people that are approved investigators for their clinical trial. They're going to be opening this up as approvals get moving through the FDA and people are actually able to administer this in their clinics. So there'll be opportunities for that. So if you are interested in becoming an MDMA therapist, I highly encourage you to check out this training. I've linked the website here. Again, as I noted before, there is sort of a lack of representation of people of color in the psychedelic research space. So in 2019, Marcelo Otolora and Monica Williams are both therapists of color, and they were recognizing this as an issue, specifically in the MDMA clinical trials. And so they hosted this MDMA therapy training for communities of color and psychedelic medicine and cultural trauma community workshop in Kentucky in 2019. So that increased some of the diversity of the available therapists that are able to administer MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, but there were some issues I won't get into just about it's still not necessarily being culturally relevant or appropriate, specifically around treating things like racial trauma. So there's some ongoing work by MAPS and some other therapists, especially Monica Williams, who's sort of at the forefront of this within the psychedelic research space, to really get more therapists of color trained and making sure that other therapists are aware of the differences in how trauma manifests in different cultural contexts and situations across different racial groups. So another program that clinicians can get involved with is the California Institute for Integral Studies. They have a certificate for psychedelic therapies and research, which again is only open to licensed therapists of various types. So they have a lot of different professions that they will admit. So like I mentioned, some of the other licensed counselors that I mentioned before, they'll also take naturopathic doctors, various flavors of medical doctors, physician's assistants, traditional Chinese medicine practitioners, nurses, ordained clergy, so chaplains. So these are people that have a master's in divinity and do clinical work. These are often kind of the priests that you'll see in the hospital or in hospice care. that help people at the end of life. They've also extended this to lawyers who kind of have counseling specialties. So those kind of people that are working with really intense family situations where there's a lot of trauma and harm being done. And so those lawyers have extra training in counseling. So they're also eligible, as well as physical therapists and other things. So if you currently have one of these licenses or you are in school to get one, you may be eligible for this program, but it's very expensive. It's about $10,000 to do the training. So just keep that in mind. Another program is Fluence. So this is a program that was started by Elizabeth Nielson and Ingmar Gorman. They're both trained MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD therapists, trained by MAPS, and they also are doing psilocybin clinical trials at NYU for alcohol use disorder and I think depression as well. And so they have their own company that they started, Fluence, where they train licensed therapists to do psychedelic integration psychotherapy. And so they have a lot of courses on their website. This is one of them. They have this postgraduate certificate in psychedelic integration therapy that gets paired with an experiential training that they're going to do in the fall. So again, if you're interested in this route, I suggest that. But again, it's another one of these programs that's like upwards of $10,000 to take. So, you know, in terms of privilege and access and trying to get a more diverse psychedelic therapy cohort, you know, it would be good if there was things that weren't so cost prohibitive and time prohibitive. You know, because privilege takes many forms, whether it's access, finances, and even just time. Like, who has the time to, you know, before COVID, travel to all these different places to take these trainings, or spend tens of thousands of dollars, unless your job is paying for it. You know, some clinics are really good about compensating for continuing education for their therapists, but not all of them, especially if you're in private practice, it might not be the most feasible option. So hopefully as this becomes more available, this, you know, like I would love to be able to get something like this integrated into the clinician training programs at university levels and residency programs. So it's just sort of baked in to existing clinical training that people have to do and get their supervisory hours. And this is just one specialty that could be included in that. But for the time being, it's pretty exclusive and prohibitive unless you have tens of thousands of dollars and lots of time to devote to continuing this work and getting trained in this additional part of your practice. So that's for the therapist route. I would say for becoming a psychedelic researcher, if you want to do psychedelic research, not in kind of a clinical setting in terms of treating patients, you can go the route that I've gone. So I'm not a clinician. I have a PhD in neurobiology, and I understand a lot about how trauma affects the brain. But I'm not necessarily trained in the clinical manifestations of trauma, so that if somebody was sitting in front of me having an episode or a flashback with PTSD, I don't necessarily have those skills to manage that. But I am interested in sort of using psychedelics to study the human brain and study the mind and study cognition and consciousness in healthy people, as well as partnering with clinicians that might want to work with me to use them for training for a clinical population, but recognizing my own limitations and not going beyond my scope of what I can do with people, which is really more about the neuroscience research aspect of it. And so, you know, in order to go that route, what you need is a degree in the field you want to study. So if you want to do psychedelic neuroscience, you need to get a PhD in neuroscience and do postdoctoral training in that field and learn the techniques and the skills that will help you be the best researcher. So, you know, for me, the kind of work that I do MRI research. And so it's really good to understand how the brain works, to understand how MRIs work, on top of understanding all that's involved in actually having to sit with somebody that's having a psychedelic experience and make sure that you're creating a really safe setting for them. And recognizing that I don't have that skills, I pair with a psychiatrist, because I know that they'll be able to handle any psychiatric issues that might come up in the research participants. But then I stick to the side of kind of doing the science of it and understanding how to induce and measure neuroplasticity. Yeah, so that's one route. I would say if you're interested in going into policy, it would be really helpful if you first became a lawyer, because there's a lot of legal jargon and a lot of like policy documents that, you know, I think a lot of people that go into politics and become senators or legislators of some kind, their first point of order to go down that path is to become a lawyer, because you have to understand all this stuff very well if you're going to be working in that field. So lots of different options to become a psychedelic professional. It's very exciting to be working in this space, but you know, if you're kind of just coming at this and haven't started any kind of education or training along those routes, it's not something that's just going to happen overnight. But if it's also a field that I don't think is going away anytime soon, and we're just seeing the beginnings of it. And I think there's still so much to discover and learn and explore. And there's so much potential in this field that I think if you're wanting to do this, just go ahead and get started. You know, I mean, I'm not a therapist, but I'm even considering potentially like starting a therapy training program so that I can at least be a licensed mental health professional, so I can incorporate that into my research. And I know that that's going to take me a while, but I know that if that's something I want to do, I should probably get started. So yeah, that's what I have to share with all of you. I recognize this is a video, so there's not really going to be a Q&A section, but feel free to go ahead and send me an email at this account that this is posted to, and I'd be happy to field any of your questions that you may have. And thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to any questions that you might have.